see the Lord, and His train fills the temple.
Welcome back to Private Conversations with Pastor Terry. And today we are talking more about deliverance, the ministry of deliverance. And Pastor Terry, you've been teaching on Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. about the ministry of deliverance. You're kind of doing a master class right now. And that's going to be going on for
About
5 more weeks?
5 more weeks, I think.
Okay. And so if you haven't seen that yet, again, if you go back to the live section on the YouTube channel where it says live, you'll see all the deliverance class videos. And it looks like a chess piece on there. So you can actually, that's how you can identify it. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more and just kind of going deeper on some of what you talked about on Sunday during the class. So, you know, in deliverance ministry, we talk a lot about the types and shadows. And you brought out on Sunday how, you know, when Jesus showed up on the scene, all of a sudden there's demons everywhere. He's casting out demons left and right. And in the Old Testament, you don't see them a whole lot. You do with Saul, I think, and a couple of other places. But walk us through, like, the types and shadows in the Bible, and how do we begin to discern, you know, where the demonic is, I guess, in the Word.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you study the Bible, you know, you see when Jesus shows up, all of a sudden the demons begin to manifest when he's preaching. Everywhere he goes, there's demonic activity. And the people really are not surprised by it at all. So obviously they've been used to this all this time.
Yeah,
it's not
that's pretty interesting.
It didn't just show up in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And so it's not a surprise at all by the people, even the Canaanite woman who's not Jewish. Mm-hmm. She knows her daughter's got a demon. So demonic activity is very well known in the days that Jesus was on the earth. So you got to realize that it's been going on for years, centuries actually, and from the beginning. But in the Old Testament, it doesn't really go into it that often. And you go, well, how did they come in, and where do they show up, and what is demonic in the Old Testament? And so as you go into deliverance and you study the Word, you begin to develop, you know, the concept of demonization even in the Old Testament. And so there are types and shadows, and we talked about it before. The New Testament sometimes goes into it, and then you can go back to the Old and figure it out. But the birds of the air and the sower and the seed were demons, you know. So then when you go back into the Old Testament and you begin to study, you'll say they become food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. What he's not talking about, the birds and the beasts are physically coming in and eating the people. That's not what he's talking about. It's symbolism for the demonic. And so as I taught last week, if you go back and re-listen to that, you'll see that we talked about the birds of the air, the beasts of the field. The serpent is another type. The dragon is another type of demons. And you go into the book of Job, and where Satan had access to Job, and we see the Chaldeans came in and killed the people there, are sometimes a type of the demonic in the Old Testament, a release of the demonic, Chaldeans being the Babylonians. You also see the wind came, and it caused destruction. So wind also is a type of demonic. Not always is a wind referring to demons, but sometimes it is. And
Usually
so,
like the whirlwind.
The tornadoes, the storms, you know. And also, you know, there is a correlation between the demonic and the things of God, because Satan is a counterfeit of God, and so he counterfeits the Spirit of God to deceive. So on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came with wind and fire. And so there is a wind and fire of God, and there is a wind and fire of demons. So there is a correlation between the types and shadows of God and the types and shadows of Satan, because he tries to counterfeit. And like the river of of the Holy Spirit. You know, he says, out of your belly will flow rivers of living water. This he spoke of the Spirit. So there's a river there that represents the Spirit of God. But in the book of Revelation, it says Satan poured water like a river out of his mouth that caused a woman to be swept away with the flood. So there is a river of words of the wrong spirit. And the flood is a type of the demonic.
Yeah.
So these are things I just learned over the years, by studying. And so it's very important when you're doing deliverance to know the scripture and know where the demonic is being referred to versus sometimes where it is actual physical. And many times it's physical and spiritual at the same time. So like when Jesus was in the storm and he rebuked the wind, he's talking to the wind. Well, they said even the winds and the storms, the sea obeys him. Well, the sea is another type of the powers of darkness. Sometimes the wind is. So he's speaking to the demonic that's stirring up the winds. So in the book of Job, the winds come, but it's Satan stirring up the winds to cause this to happen. It's Satan that caused the tornado, Satan that caused the fire, all that stuff. So that's how you get this. So understanding those types and shadows gives you a little better idea of what's going on spiritually when you read the Old Testament, especially, and also in the New, in many cases.
And I think going back to Job, I think that's one of the clearest examples, and it may be one that a lot of people aren't real familiar with. So Satan came before the Lord and said, asked basically for access to Job, and God says, okay, you can touch all that is his, but you don't touch him. And then it doesn't say, and then Satan went out and did all this stuff. It says, and then all of a sudden a storm came.
Or the Chaldeans came. Or fire. It says the fire of God fell. But that's the way they looked at it. It wasn't really the fire of God. It was the fire from the demonic. So the demonic can control those things. The natural elements. They have ability to do that. And of course God can too. So you have to kind of look at the context of Scripture to understand whether it's demonic or whether it's maybe just a physical thing. And like I said, many times it's both, And so the demonic does definitely affects the physical arena,
Yeah, and it's amazing because I think many times we read stories like that and we don't get what it's saying a lot of times. We just read it and it's like, oh, that's interesting. But we don't realize, oh my gosh, we don't connect all the dots.
It's being able to connect everything, and I think that's why the Lord gives revelation to us sometimes, and then we are able to connect it up. And I think one of the big ones that I use a lot is when David numbered Israel, and this is a really key scripture that a lot of people struggle with. When David numbered Israel, it's in Chronicles and also in Samuel. It says that the anger of the Lord rose up against David and incited him to number Israel. And then another account of that says Satan rose up and caused David to number Israel. So the anger of the Lord is another terminology for Satan. And people freak out when they hear that and they say, well, you're saying God's the devil and all this. And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not God. It's not the Lord. It's the anger of the Lord. So that's a terminology for Satan, And
it's basically the demons are essentially the judgment of God released.
Yeah, Satan is, in a sense, represents the anger of God, the judgment of God.
Yeah.
Jesus is the love of God,
right?
The grace of God. So that's where you get that. And then when you go into the Old Testament and you want to find out, well, how the demons get there, you'll see over and over the anger of the Lord. The anger of the Lord, the wrath of God. Well, as soon as you see that, you know that there is a demonic component to what's being released, whether it be a nation coming against them or whatever. It's also demonic activity coming against. And that's how the demons came in,
Yeah.
And so you can go back and when you start studying that, then you can see certain things that the anger of God comes up, and then well, that means more than likely those things there are opening doors for demons.
Yeah.
And those are entry points and open doors.
And let's talk about the law really quick, because God gives the law and he says, blessed are you if you do these things, cursed are you if you don't, and he lists all these curses like in Deuteronomy 28. And like if you go to Leviticus, for example, with certain types of sexual sin, there's a curse of death operating. So do you want to talk about how the curses operate, and like maybe give us a specific example of like a situation
good question,
that you've
because
encountered?
People think of a curse as like some hocus pocus or magical thing, and it's not really like that. So if you have a curse, you typically have a demonic component to the curse, because it says, like a sparrow is flighting and a swallow is flying, so a curse without a cause does not alight. So you connect the swallow, the sparrow, they're birds. There is that's the type of the powers of darkness. So following that comes the curse. So you can figure that out, that curses are carried out by the demons. Without a cause, they don't alight. So there has to be a cause, a sin, an opening, something that allowed that spirit to come. And we know that when someone is involved in witchcraft, they can use spells and curses and hexes and vexes. And when they curse somebody, what are they doing? They're sending demons. So the bird represents the curse coming in through the demonic. So that's what curses. That's how curses operate. So when you're dealing with a curse in someone's life, then you're actually dealing with a demonic spirit that's there because of either somebody doing witchcraft or something that was done that is contrary to God's ways and God's laws, and then the demons have a right to bring about the curse because of that, And if you remember, Balaam was supposed to curse the people of God, and God would not allow him to do it. So what did that mean? Well, if he cursed the people of God, what he's doing is releasing demonic spirits. So when you curse someone or speak evil of someone, then that happens. And especially if it's authority figures, because God honors authority, good or bad. So you curse your children and say, you're no good, you're dumb, you're stupid, you never amount to anything. Then the demons operate on those words, and they say, okay, because the authority said that, I have the right, because God honors authority, so I can go do it now. And that's the way it works. Likewise, you can bless, and then God sends his spirit or his angels, and his blessings. So you can bless or you can curse. That's why God says don't curse, because you're sending demons. You become an agent for the devil if you're not careful. But unfortunately today in the church, you start talking about this and people think you're nuts or crazy, and they just don't understand it. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get this across to pastors and to church leaders, denomination leaders and things. And so you do the best you can and try to show in the Word. That's why I use the Word a lot when I'm teaching on deliverance, to explain it in the Word so that people go, oh yeah, really, this is real, So that's kind of the way the curses operate.
Yeah, and I think one of the most striking examples too is Proverbs 30:17. Where it says, "The eye that mocks the father scorns the obedience to the mother. The ravens of the valley will pluck it out, and the young eagles will eat it." Well, almost everybody has done that at some point in their lives, but we don't see eagles and ravens, plucking out the eyes, and so it's clear that that is the demonic. Like it releases the demonic to remove your spiritual vision, your eyesight, so you can't see clearly and you can't make a decision.
Yeah, and that's why the book of Proverbs is a very powerful book in understanding deliverance. I've used it a lot in doing deliverance and understanding the symptoms and entry points through those things, And so that's why he says, I'm going to restore the heart of the father to the children, otherwise I'm going to bring a curse. So curse is demons, And so when John the Baptist came, he did that restoration and to break the curse, and then Jesus came in and cast all the demons out. So that's the way it works. And it hasn't changed. It's still the same today. Jesus hasn't changed. The Spirit of God hasn't changed. The devil hasn't changed. It's just that we have got kind of a watered down version of the gospel today, I think, in many cases. And it's unfortunate because the people of God, many of the people of God are suffering today. And there is help and healing, but unfortunately most don't ever receive it. And that's one of the reasons God called us to do this ministry, and why we teach it, and why we're doing the podcast, so people can see that there is hope and there's help.
Yeah, absolutely. There is hope. And
Absolutely.
I think for years I struggled, growing up, like, oh my gosh, is there hope? Can I get out of this stuff? Can I know God's word is true, but like it's not
being
manifesting in my life.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to remove the demonic, and but like you said, just so many people don't know, and
it's unfortunate.
It is. So let's talk a little bit about symptoms. You often refer to it as symptoms and entry points. And so how does the devil get in? It's like, okay, I know I've got a demon, or I see a demon, maybe in my spouse or my children. How did it get there?
Yeah, how does it get there? Or how do you even know you have something?
Yes.
And so that's kind of a little tricky, and it's like when I'm teaching on symptoms and everything, I always tell people, when I start telling you all these symptoms, everybody's going to say, oh my gosh, I got 1,000 demons because I have this symptom, I struggle with this thing. And it's kind of like if you describe a symptom of a sickness or a disease, all of a sudden you start feeling like, oh my gosh, I got that, So how do you know that you might have a demonic activity going on that you need to get rid of? And so when there's something happening in your life that you cannot get victory over, if you turn to, I think Romans 7 is a great explanation of this. And this is where Paul is describing a situation. And he says, if you go to Romans 7, let's go to 14. I'm going to read some scripture here. It says, I know the law is spiritual, but I'm of the flesh, sold into bondage or slavery to sin. So the flesh is in slavery to sin. The flesh sins. It doesn't do good, it sins. Then he says, for what I'm doing, I don't understand. And he's talking as a believer here, not as a non-believer. For I'm not practicing what I would like to do, and I'm doing the very thing I hate. So Paul I think he struggled with those same things that we do, and you may look at it as hypothetical, but I think he's talking about himself and believers in general. He said, if I do the very thing I don't want to do, I agree with the law, confessing the law is good. So he said, I'm trying to do the law, I want to do it, but I can't do what I want to do. He says, so now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin dwelling in me. So he said, I don't want to do it. So if I'm doing what I don't want to do, I realize I got sin.
Yeah.
There's sin in me. And then he says, for I know that nothing good dwells in me. So in our flesh, he says, that is in my flesh. The willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. So I think a lot of believers have areas like that where you want to do the right thing, but it doesn't matter how hard you try, you fail, you cannot do it. So you're in bondage to that particular sin. And that's what he's talking about here. He said, for the good that I want, I do not do. But I practice the very evil that I do not want to do. So are you practicing things that you in your heart do not want to do? You hate it. You despise it. You get mad at yourself. You get guilty. You feel bad, condemned. Why are you still doing it? And he said, but if I'm doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin dwells in me. So there is sin in us, And the devil sinned from the beginning. So sin and demons are pretty closely connected, If you're walking in sin, there's a pretty good chance there's a demonic thing. If you cannot put it to death in the flesh, then that means there's more than likely a demonic component to the sin itself.
Well, doesn't 1 John 3 say that if we... I forget the scripture.
Whoever practices sin is of the devil.
Yes.
He who practices righteousness is from God.
So
if you practice sin, you're of the devil. So that means, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, that means there's a demonic control over your life. There's a spirit operating here, and you need to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And he says, I find the principle that evil is present in me, not on me, not around me, in me.
Yeah.
Demons are in you, you know, and people don't want to admit that, but you know, hopefully you'll come to a better understanding of that. That is a principle. The one who wants to do good, so that should be all believers. You want to do good, but you also find there's an evil thing present in you. Well, who's the evil one? Satan is the evil one. So sin and demons are kind of synonymous in a sense. He said, for I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. So he agrees with the law of God. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, making me a prisoner. So he's a prisoner. He's in bondage. Well, what does that mean? Well, who is the gatekeeper and who is the head of the prison? It's the devil, you know. And so I'm a prisoner of the law of sin. So he's in prison. Remember when the guy wouldn't forgive, he threw him into prison. And remember in Revelation it says Babylon has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison of every unclean and hateful bird.
Yeah, there's the birds again.
There's your birds, and there's your prison, and there's your demons. So here's the prison, and you're a prisoner, and you're a prisoner of the devil. You know, that's what it is. So you're in bondage to him, and you're doing his will, not the will of God. So obviously, you're not going to get free of that till you get get out of the prison, or get whoever's keeping you prisoner out of you. And so in this case, it's the demonic. And you say, well, how do you really know that? Well, let's just go on. It says, wretched man that I am, who's going to set me free? What does that mean? It means he needs to be set free.
Yeah.
Right? And Jesus said, I've come to set the captives free. What does that mean? To set you free from the sin and from the demons. That's what he's talking about. He said, who's going to set me free from the body of this death? He needs deliverance. That's what he's saying. He says, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ. So the Lord sets you free. How does he set you free? You cast the demons out. Then you obey the truth. And then he makes you free. So he sets you free by getting rid of the demons that are compelling you to do those things. And then you're made free as you obey the truth. Then the demons don't get back in and you become free. That's the way it works. And so he says, thanks be to God through the Lord Jesus Christ. So then on one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other hand, with my flesh, the law of sin. So if you're in a position where there is let's just take pornography for instance, that you cannot overcome that. No matter what you do, you still are involved in it. Or fornication, or drugs, or alcohol, any of those addictions or any of those sins that you don't want to do it, you've repented of it, you've done everything you know, but you still fall back into it. Then there is something that's making you do that, causing you to do it. You're still responsible. You can't blame the devil and everything, but there's a demonic component more than likely, and you need deliverance from that demon. Once that demon is out, then he's not compelling you in your mind and in your body and in your flesh, bringing up feelings and thoughts to go and do this. They're gone. And demons work on your mind, they work on your flesh, your body. And when that demon's gone, then that's not there. You still have the flesh nature that then you have to die to the flesh, but that's different than casting out a demon. The flesh is one thing, the demons are another. The demons operate on the flesh. And this is the way that I've learned over the years, you know, that's the way it works, you know. So.
It's amazing when you get the demons out, how much easier it is to walk in righteousness.
Then you can, it's a matter of your will to say no to the flesh. But saying no to a demon is very hard because it's like, I mean, if you have a thorn in your flesh, like Paul said, he had a thorn in the flesh. That thing is hurting all the time. It needs attention. It's distracting you. It's causing you pain. It's causing you discomfort. It's making you think things that you don't want to think. And that's the way the demonic operates. So until you get the demon out, you're going to struggle with those things.
And do you want to speak to, I know some people might be listening and being like, how, where am I going to go to get a demon cast out? And I've had situations like when I was very young, I was addicted to pornography. And one day I confessed to my dad and he prayed for me. And immediately it was gone. And that desire was gone. And so I didn't know that I got a demon cast out, but I mean, I probably did.
Yeah.
But like, I just want people to not be confused that the Lord can deliver you any which way.
Yeah.
And it really begins with confession and repentance, right? The John
Absolutely.
Baptist ministry. And, that's where you start. And then sometimes the Lord will just deliver you.
Yeah, he does. Sometimes there's no outward manifestation. I've seen that, and people get delivered, and they don't even sometimes know. There's not any outward necessary manifestation. Many times, most of the time, there is, but not always.
Yeah.
And the fact that your Father is authority in your life, He has authority over that.
Mm-hmm.
He has authority over you, authority over the demonic in your life.
Yeah.
And even sometimes when you don't even know what you're doing, sometimes you can actually get delivered. Some cases are a little more difficult, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think in general, all Christians should be able to cast out demons when they're confronted with it. Casting out of yourself is a little more to it as you grow in the Lord. Mm-hmm. But He says that these signs will follow those who believe in my name. They'll cast out demons. Mm-hmm. So if you're a believer, you ought to be able to do this. Mm-hmm. And I think being able to cast out a demon is one thing. Having a quote full-blown deliverance ministry is a little different than that. Because demons manifesting in front of someone and you being a believer, you ought to have that ability to cast it out. But I know sometimes in our church we've had demons manifest and people are praying and they don't get it out. So sometimes there's knowledge that you need to have in order to get things out. Sometimes maybe a level of authority that you need that maybe you don't have yet. I know that when I first started, there was a level of authority that I had, but then as I did more and more and learned more and more, then I got more authority. And just like with anything, as you practice and as you get experience, you get better and you get more knowledge and you get more authority.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you have to grow in your authority and grow in your knowledge. And so knowing the Word is extremely important. If you don't know the Word, then the demons can have access and you don't know how they got there and how to get them out. Yeah. And so many times it is a process of finding out what caused that demon to get there and going back to that root and then dealing with it. And so I've had that happen where we prayed for people and we could not get to the root, and then maybe a few weeks later God showed the person what it was or showed one of us, and then we were able to go in and deal with it, and out they came.
You think that, I've heard you say this a lot, and I know we've seen it, like when someone is repentant and they come and they're basically ready and they just get delivered very easily a lot of times. But many times it's hard to discover, or you have to spend a lot of time discovering what is the root. How did this thing get in? Why is this behavior operating in your life? And like you said, if you don't know the word, you're just it's not even going to show up on your radar that, oh my gosh, there's a curse of death on this particular sin right here.
Yeah.
Or something else.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's just like, one of the curses we were reading, in, I think it was in Leviticus, about curses of sexual immorality, incest, and illegitimate birth. And people don't realize that those curses still exist. It hasn't changed. And there's curses of death on incest. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the demons come in and start operating to cause death in that person. It doesn't mean they're going to die right away necessarily. It doesn't mean, they may die in 10 years, but they start working diseases in your body, or setting up traps and situations where you maybe even commit suicide, or you do things that will bring about your death. So there are curses of death, and you need to be aware of that. And so when I realize what maybe has gone on in the person's life, then we know what spirits that we're looking at. We're looking at a spirit of death or destruction, destroyer, something like that. So yeah, so it's important. And then if you look at scriptures like the eye that mocks a father and scorns a mother, the ravens of the valley will pluck it out, the young eagles will eat it. You mentioned it earlier. Well, right away with that, there's a spirit of mockery. The eye that mocks, there's mockery in that person.
Yeah.
They mock an authority. It talks about in the last days, people will mock authority, you know. And so from those things, you know what spirit is there.
Yeah.
And you know spiritual blindness is there, deception is there.
Yeah.
Probably lying is there. So that's how you begin to discern, you know, what spirits that you're going after.
Yeah, that's so amazing. It's, again, for me, it always makes me just be in awe of the Lord because His Word is so powerful and it's absolutely true every single time. And it's just amazing.
Now my guilt is gone, and my sin has been forgiven.